Scribbly Gum presents The Seaside Witch, Episode 10. Penelope roused me in a typical cat-like manner by landing right beside my head and flicking her velvet tail back and forth across my face. I awoke with a sneeze and the overwhelming urge to scratch off my nose. Her job complete, Penelope proceeded to wash one of her white-socked paws, then the other, ignoring the waves of displeasure and pointedly angry thoughts issuing from my general direction. It took me a few minutes to organise the fluff in my head enough to form coherent thoughts. It had been a late night. There had been at least one fruity cocktail, and there had been a lot of energy spent trying to avoid Al, and my social function muscles hadn't had any kind of workout in months. I was exhausted. No, I was more than exhausted, I was catatonic. It was Sunday, and all I wanted to do was curl up under the blanket and rest. As the thought emanated from my mind, the feline equivalent of a feather duster brushed across my nose. "For Pete's sake, Penelope," I said in my croaky morning voice, furiously scratching at my nose, "will you leave me the heck alone?" There was a sneer in her tone as she replied in a sing-song voice specifically designed to annoy me. "There's a man in the kitchen. He was knocking rather insistently on the door and Selma let him in and asked me to show him up." As she finished speaking the words directly into my cotton wool mind, I heard the sound of something heavy scraping on the wooden floorboards down the hall. I was too grumpy to even be alarmed at the thought of a strange man being there. I lay for another moment in my deliciously warm bed, hoping it was all a bad dream. Penelope flicked her tail one final time, and that did it. "I don't know why Valerie bothers with the front door at all," I grumbled, as I threw back the covers, earning a satisfying yowl from Penelope. "It's not like it ever actually keeps anyone out." Somewhere amongst the debris on the floor, I located my crumpled floral dressing gown. Donning a pair of slippers, I wrapped it around me to conceal my knickers and the t-shirt I'd worn to the party yesterday. A quick glance in the mirror confirmed that my hair resembled that of a scarecrow who'd been struck by lightning. But I had no idea where my brush was, and didn't have the bandwidth to conduct a search, so it would have to do. It was beyond rude for someone to show up here before I'd had my morning cup of tea, so they could take me as they found me. Almost as an afterthought, I grabbed a very witchy-looking broomstick from the corner of my room, because it never hurt to be prepared, and then stomped down the hallway towards the kitchen. I made no effort to be quiet. The man was standing in front of the fridge, with the door open, peering inside. But I didn't hit him with the broomstick, or berate him for pilfering a dash of milk, because I knew him by the scruff on the back of his neck, by the tilt of his head, by the way his right arm leaned on the top of the door, as if it was a shelf. "Dad?" He jerked back from the fridge and stepped sideways to face me. He stared at me, in shock, for a long moment, his mouth moving soundlessly. Finally, the volume kicked in. "Assie, what are you doing here? Where's Valerie?" "Off terrorizing some villagers in South America. I'm looking after the shop for 6 months. She's not here?" "Nope. She's been gone for the best part of a month." "Oh." He fell silent as the alarm from the fridge started beeping insistently. With a sigh, he slowly closed the door of the fridge. The clock ticked loudly from the corner of the room as my brain tried to process the fact that my dad was standing in the kitchen, raiding the fridge no less. My dad, who lived on a farm 6 hours away, was somehow standing in Great Aunt Valerie's kitchen, in his slightly torn flannelette shirt, with his moth-eaten akubra. My dad. Yeah, we get it, witch, your dad's here. Penelope strolled into the room, her tail flicking back and forth. Thanks for the heads up, I growled at her from somewhere in the back of my brain. Well, if you got up and fed me on time, maybe I'd be nicer to you. Carrots and lamb today, chop chop. With that, Penelope walked up to the counter near my dad, leapt up and started purring loudly as he reached out to pet her. My dad had always been better with animals than with people, but it still surprised me a bit. It's not like Penelope was any regular type of animal. I half expected her to swat his hand away with her clawed paw, but she simply settled down on the countertop as if it was the comfiest place in the world. There was a particularly self-satisfied expression on her feline face as she closed her green eyes in bliss. I let out an exasperated sigh, leaned the broomstick against the wall near the door, and crossed the room to search amongst the tins of cat food for one labelled carrots and lamb. It was too early in the day to be taking orders from a talking cat. It was too early in the day for my dad to be standing in Great Aunt Valerie's kitchen. It was just too darn early. Even if the clock on the wall did say 9:45 a.m., it was Sunday. Sundays were supposed to be for rest. My mouth was set in a grim line as I scooped the wet food into Penelope's bowl, nearly gagging at the smell of it. That one fruity cocktail wasn't sitting so well in the harsh light of the day. Of course, Penelope completely ignored the prompt delivery of her food and went on arching her neck and purring as my dad scratched behind her black velvet ears. She'd never purred when I petted her. Not once. I could have sworn the purring grew even louder as I thought that. Damn her and her ability to read minds. Dad didn't say anything to fill the silence. He focused on the task in front of him. One long stroke, from Penelope's little ears right to the end of her flicking tail. I allowed him a couple of moments to be lost in his reverie before my curiosity overwhelmed me. So what brings you all the way up to Rosewood Bay, Dad? He jerked at the sound of my voice, as if he'd completely forgotten I was there. Honestly, that wouldn't have been out of character for him. Well, for either of my parents, really. I'd often wondered why they even decided to have a child. I counted 15 ticks of the clock and 7 deep, smug purrs from Penelope before he answered. Just wanted to chat with Valerie. I'd had no idea that he and Valerie were even on speaking terms. Not just because Mum had left him, but also because, let's face it, my dad wasn't exactly much of a talker. Isn't Valerie Mum's aunt? Yep, he said, wincing at the mention of my mother. So you and Great Aunt Valerie are what, secretly friends? I suppose. It was like trying to coax water from a rock. Exhausted by the effort of obtaining those 24 sparse words, I decided that the interrogation could continue after a much-needed cup of tea and a couple of biscuits. The good ones. The ones dipped in chocolate with chewy bits of fudge in them. The ones you really weren't supposed to have for breakfast. But it was Sunday. I'd been rudely awoken and forced to face this awkward situation. This was exactly the sort of thing the good biscuits were for. Tea? Dad nodded, relief flooding his face, and finally left Penelope on the counter and sat down in one of the creaking wooden chairs at the kitchen table. His gaze fell on the shredded cushion cover on the chair next to him, and he briefly raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. I suppose Great Aunt Valerie had always had the house in perfect order on his other visits. I harumphed quietly to myself as I filled the kettle and watched with a tinge of satisfaction as Penelope finally ate her breakfast. While the water was boiling, I rummaged around in the larder again for the biscuits. The good ones. Both Great Aunt Valerie and I always kept at least one packet in there for emergencies. I set them out on a plate, 6 each, the minimum required to get through any sort of conversation with my dad. Then I made a steaming pot of Earl Grey, filled the milk jug halfway, and set it all on the table. Finally I got 2 mugs from the cupboard, one with a pink thistle flower for Dad, and a kookaburra in mid-cackle for me, and sat down across from my father. Penelope finished her food and departed. I remained in the uncomfortable near silence, munching on 1 biscuit, then 2, and taking large gulps of scalding tea. The fragrant tang of bergamot soothed something in me. I shoveled another biscuit into my mouth before looking up. My dad was chewing on a biscuit and looking out the window. "Why are you here, Dad?" I asked again, trying to keep the edge of frustration out of my voice. "Sheep tonic." "What?" "For lungworm." The cogs in my brain turned slowly, as if they were suspended in porridge. But I eventually put the words together. "You drove 6 hours to get some tonic for your sheep." "Yep." This was the most compelling proof I had to date that my Great Aunt Valerie was indeed a witch. Forget the talking cat or the shop's ledger. Forget the coven and the sentient broomstick. If she could convince my dad to leave his beloved sheep, drive 6 hours in his beat-up old ute to visit in person, that was some sort of magic. He'd never visited me in the city. Not during my years at uni, not when I'd worked, not once in the 14 years since I'd left home. I'd only seen him when I'd caught the 2 trains and 3 buses out to the middle of nowhere town that I'd grown up in to visit my parents. After my mum left, the house was sold and he bought the farm, 40 acres of not much with a shack and 3 big sheds. Enough for a small herd of sheep, a sheepdog, and a man with a broken heart. I hadn't visited too much after Mum left. It was just too hard to get there, and too hard to be there, in the silence. I had tried a few times. I had even hired a car once and driven 3 hours out of the city to visit. But it was like he lived under a damp cloud. It seeped in around the edges until I became quiet as well, and we sat in that little shack with only the gentle hum of the fridge making any noise. Yet I'd only been in Rosewood Bay a couple of weeks, and here he was. "Are you staying?" He nodded. "On the couch?" He nodded again. I ate another 2 biscuits, finished another cup of tea, and finally my head cleared enough to think. It was the 5th of October. Gosh, that was Mum's birthday. Another piece of the puzzle. Poor Dad. I made a mental note to call her later. "You make yourself at home, Dad. I've got to shower and open the shop." He nodded vaguely, nibbling on the edge of a biscuit. I glanced at the clock. 10:05 a.m. I didn't usually open the shop on Sunday, but the thought of spending the entire day sitting around the kitchen table in silence was enough to drive me into the shower. I sorted out my hair, got dressed and boiled the kettle again. I'd call Mum later, when Dad wasn't around. Half an hour later, I flipped the sign on the useless front door to open and sat behind the counter with my book and a fresh pot of tea. I hadn't even found my place on the page when the bell tinkled. I stubbornly kept my eyes on the page, hoping that it was some random customer who'd spend half an hour browsing and only bother me on their way out. I read the same sentence 6 times before the footsteps led right to the counter and a shadow fell across the page. I looked up sharply. "Nice truck," said Matty. "Great patina. Did you pay extra for that?" "No, the guy at Patina Trucks on Lake Avenue threw it in for free because I smiled at him nicely," I retorted. He chuckled at that, low in his throat. "What do you want?" I asked, but not quite as sharply as I'd meant to. "Another bear trap for all the grizzlies we have wandering around the bay?" The slight upturn of his lips disappeared and he frowned down at me. "I promise you, little lady, I wish I was tracking grizzlies." I bristled at his turn of phrase, but still looked for the teasing crease in his brow. There was none. Just a deep furrow between his eyebrows and a turn to his mouth, as if he'd tasted something bitter, as if it hadn't actually been a joke. Before I could come up with some witty repartee, the bell on the door chimed again, and Al strode in. Both men stood to their full height. Matty looked even scruffier and more animalistic, standing next to the perfectly coiffed Al. "Matty, it's good to see you," Al said, slapping him on the shoulder. Matty simply grunted and disappeared into the back of the store, but I would have bet the rest of my pot of tea he was listening to every word. "I brought you something," Al said, with a conspiratorial smile, proffering one of the all-of-my-favourite-things bags across the counter. "I have a pretty good feeling that you're going to like it." I almost rolled my eyes, but I managed to keep it together. "A gift?" I asked, raising my eyebrows instead. "Think of it as a little welcome to the community, from one store owner to another." "But I don't own this store." "From one shopkeeper to another, then." "What is it?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. "Why don't you take a look?" It was a beautifully packed packet of loose-leaf Earl Grey tea and some of the good biscuits. Something in me melted just a little bit. It was a dangerous thing for a stranger to know all of your favourite things without having to put in any of the effort to get to know you, because it felt like he did know me. Far better than my ex. Far better than my own mother. Certainly better than my dad. "They look delicious, thank you." He smiled one of his perfect Disney Prince smiles. "Now, about dinner." The expression on my face caused him to trail off. Maybe it was the fact that Dad was upstairs, or that Matty was lurking somewhere in the back of the shop, but I was very resolute when I spoke. "Al, I appreciate you introducing yourself and being friendly and all, and I'm obsessed with your store, but I've just come out of a long-term relationship and I'm going through it after a brutal breakup, so I'm not looking for anything other than friendship at the moment." I had no idea where the words and the courage came from to say them, but for a moment I glowed with pride and maybe just a little bit of embarrassment. Al nodded thoughtfully, as if I'd simply said tomorrow would be a sunny day. "Ah, I see," he said. "Well, how would you feel about a dinner? As friends, of course, and perhaps a board game. You could meet a few other locals, and I do make a mean lasagna." That's a lovely offer, but maybe some other time. My dad's visiting at the moment, and we already have plans." We didn't, but we would. "As you wish, Astrid," Al said. "Enjoy your Sunday." With another dazzling smile, Al left, probably back to his fabulous store. I wondered if the shelves were stocked with all of his favourite things, if he was the only one in there. I was still pondering what some of Al's favourite things might be when Matty appeared, with 3 gruesome-looking metal contraptions. I wrote them up in the book. He paid, and as he was leaving, he turned back. "Al really does make a good lasagna." Then he was gone. It was an odd comment to make. From their brief interaction, I'd got the distinct impression that the two men didn't like each other at all. But perhaps that's why Matty had said it, to throw me off balance and have me questioning what it meant. I savagely reopened my book and forced myself to focus on the page. The rest of the day was quiet. I called Mum, but there was no answer. She was probably off on one of her silent retreats somewhere. I closed the shop and went upstairs to find Dad tinkering with the pipe under the sink. The kitchen table had been sanded and waxed, the wobbly leg on the couch was wobbly no more, and the trickle sound in the toilet had disappeared somewhere. We ate a silent dinner, silent aside from the ticking of the clock and the humming of the fridge. Then we watched an episode of Grand Designs before heading to bed.